So in today's lesson, we're going to look at the role and influence of official and unofficial um, censorship on Bollywood, as well as power and authority on the micro, meso, and macro levels, and how that influences Bollywood as well. So the first major official censorship in the macro level is obviously the government, and the creation of regulatory boards by the government, which have considerable power over what content is included within the films, but also controls consumption to some extent. So, and what we're talking about here is mostly the Indian government. We're not necessarily talking about the global government. So when it says British government, that's referring to the British government in India when it was still a part of the British colony. So as we know, Bollywood was used as a means to challenge the British government at first, and so the British government set up the Central Board of Film and Censors and Film Advisory Board in 1940 to kind of control this anti-British sentiment that was growing in Bollywood, and kind of banned any anti-British films. And then this had an influence on the types of films that were being made in Bollywood, as they mostly were about the war in the 1930s and the 40s. So it was really hard to make films challenging the British government during this time. They still did it though, but it was a little bit more difficult to do it. And then after 1947, when India gained its independence, there was the Rahithian ideal, which has kind of been explained in previous lessons, and Gandhi's view, which saw Bollywood as being, a vice rather than an aid to society, because the Rahithian ideal is that film or cinema should be directed to lifting up the public and educating the public, not necessarily just entertaining it. And so they didn't really like films that were mostly just about about entertaining people. They wanted the focus on building the nation and establishing ideals that they saw as worthy. So because of that, a lot of content was restricted. They didn't value Bollywood as much as the people did, in terms of it being a representation of of India and its culture. They saw it more as just kind of like a downgrading of the culture rather than lifting it up. And as I said, they viewed it as a vice. And so because of this, they placed under the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, not under entertainment. And because of that, they were able to really restrict what was being produced as well. It also meant that Bollywood was not able to get proper funding, and so they had to rely on the black market to do that. But in 1998, this shifted as Bollywood was given industry status, which is recognising it as a legitimate economic activity, which is essentially supporting it, because then it allows the producers and stars to get proper funding, so to get loans from banks or for businesses to support it, rather than having to rely on the black market, which has really opened up Bollywood to the kind of content that we see in the films today. There was also tight regulations and controls on Bollywood from the independent government in the 1940s, which were relaxed after this industry status was provided to them. So the producers didn't have to pay as much tax as they initially had, which therefore allowed greater money to be funneled into the films to create a greater spectacle, which, as we know, is a part of why Bollywood is enjoyed so much by its audiences. However, the government did establish the Central Board of Film Certification, which is independent from the government, which does remove power from the government. However, it still has kind of influence in the restriction of the films. The Central Board of Film Certification, they can appoint people to it, so that it still kind of gives them some influence in the decisions that are made there, but they can't directly influence it. So this kind of shift from the British government to the independent government to the government since 1998 shows a clear shift in that power and the official censorship. So British government, we saw war films in between the 1947s essentially till 1998. Bollywood film was heavily restricted in terms of its financing. So whilst there was a spectacle, it's not kind of the lavish spectacle that we see today in Bollywood. So definitely that kind of shift from the Rahithian view of Bollywood to it being viewed as a more worthy, valued kind of industry definitely has changed the content that's been able to be involved in Bollywood films, as well as increasing the expenditure on the films and therefore the spectacle within the films as well. So the CBFC, I'm going to look at that a little bit more closely. It has considerable control over what is and isn't allowed to be screened, because after every film is made, they will review it and then they will decide what should be allowed in the films and what shouldn't. And so they have power and authority through controlling consumption, so what is seen and by who, because they also provide the ratings to the films. So if they believe the content in the film is allowed to stay, but it's a little bit too highbrow for younger kids, they'll put a higher rating on it. So like an A, which is for adults, a UA, which is for restricted to adults. To stop younger people from watching it, so they can control what is seen and by who. So they're currently focused on protecting Indian identity and culture from Western influences. However, they also realise the need to appeal to Indian audiences. So the CBFC is made up of people within the industry, so film critics, producers, stars, and people involved in the industry. Obviously, they can't review their own films, so the board kind of has several members, and they kind of change as they review the films as they go along. So they're kind of in that in between of wanting to maintain Indian values and Indian life within Bollywood, but also recognising the need to appeal to diasporic audiences. So they do allow kind of that content within it, but there is still restrictions on how much the diaspora can be represented in Bollywood and how much it can shift to more Western ideals rather than reflecting Indian values. So an example of this was recommended 89 cuts to Uddar Punja, which was a film made in 2016. The film still went ahead, but there was lots of proceedings before it was allowed to go ahead. As it said, CBFC recommended 89 cuts to the film, and that was because they believed that they couldn't allow Punjab to be damned and labelled a drug haven, because the entire film is kind of demonstrating and representing the drug issues for the youth in Punjab, and they didn't like the reference to Punjab itself. And so Parja Nahan, which was the head of the CBFC, said that quote. However, this was overturned by the High Court, with one cut having to be made, and then it was released. So as we can see, the film still had a reference to Punjab in it, so that one was able to go ahead. In saying that, though, even if those cuts had stuck, even if the reference to Punjab was removed, even if all those other scenes was removed, this was a highly controversial film, and so there was a lot of news media following the CBFC's rulings and the restrictions on the release of the film. And so because of that, the cover by the Bollywood media undermines the authority of the CBFC, because it just drove demand for consumption of that film. And even if those cuts had been made, the deleted scenes would have been made available, which has happened in the past for other films. On top of that, everybody knew what the film was about, who was in it, and the concerns and the controversy around it before it was even released. So even if they had removed the reference to Punjab, the scenes that the CBFC board was concerned about, everybody would have known what was in it and what it was referring to. So the censorship wouldn't have removed that from people's consciousness and minds. So whilst it might have removed it from the film, it wouldn't have removed the ideas being out in the public. So so that definitely undermines the power and the authority the CBFC has through the coverings of the Bollywood media. And then another massive influence on both what content is in there, not necessarily censorship, but what content, or in a sense, challenging censorship through the government and through the CBFC is technology. Definitely undermines the government regulatory boards. This is because it can bypass government measures of censorship as well as restrictions imposed by the ratings boards and families. So as we know, if a film gets a or an S, or even a UA. So UA is unrestricted with parent guidance, A is parent guidance, and S is special. A is adults only, and then S is special. Even with those ratings, young teenagers and children can still download the films or get access to pirated copies. So even though they're not able to go and see it in the cinema, they can still see it outside of the cinema. They can also stream it on Netflix. So technology is definitely having a massive impact on bypassing the regulations and the censorship that's already in place in Bollywood. And this is also seen through Pakistan and Bangladesh through state power and control. As we know, they've banned a lot of the Bollywood screening of films, and so they're trying to censor what people in those countries are watching. However, as we know, technology is bypassing that through the sense that they can just get access to pirated copies and download the films themselves, so it's not really restricting too much there. And then T&Cs have a massive influence as a power group on the content of Bollywood films. So A Gentleman is a film that's coming out this year, and the T&Cs, we're going to watch a clip of that film in a second, really demonstrates the kind of influence that T&Cs are having on the production of the films, because they're really driving that Western content, because they are Western businesses for the most part, like Fox. And so they're funneling lots of money into Bollywood films, so it definitely increasing the spectacle, but then also increasing the Western content, because their desire is not just to appeal to Indian audiences, but to global audiences as well, because they want to tap into all of those markets. And so because of that, it's definitely having an influence on the kind of films that are being made. And A Gentleman is made by Fox Star, and as I'm going to show you in a second, you're really going to see that high quality film, which is increasing that spectacle, which is therefore then leading to that greater consumption and growth on a global level, as well as the Indians in India love to see the spectacle as well, and so that's definitely increasing consumption within India as well, disregarding or even in spite of the Western content that's in it. They're the ones that are kind of pushing the drive and the influence of Western content within the films as well as just influencing what is in there, and definitely through the increasing of funding and the focus, as we saw, of that diasporic audience as well. And so, this is through the creation of things like Fox Star in 2008, which is, as we can see, a key player in Bollywood film development, distributing, marketing, and production. So also media influences public perception as well. So this is already, The Gentleman or A Gentleman has already been a well acclaimed film by just the way the tabloids and other media outlets like magazines have discussed the film, and have just generally built up a lot of hype around the film itself. And so they've provided the list of the actors that are in it, as well as the description of what the film is about, which is definitely significant for Indians. They're also perpetuating external myths through the utilisation of the stars. So as we can see, this actor is at the forefront of the film, and as you saw through the preview, you really got an idea and a hold of his personality throughout the film as well. So definitely building on that stars mythology as well. And then meso institutions like the cinema multiplexes have a massive role in censoring films, not by controlling what is made, but by controlling what is viewed. So they determine which films are distributed and for how long, therefore choosing the films they believe will be popular amongst the local community. So multiplex cinemas don't care about the diasporic audiences, so they're more focused on what the Indian audiences want, and therefore have a sense of control over censoring what is viewed and for how how long. They're definitely reflective of the conflict between the diaspora and Indian audience, India's influence on Bollywood, because they are focused more on driving interest for Indian audiences, and therefore want films that are reflective of the Indian desires in Indian films. So this is a good or clear example of this was the Brahman Naman film, which was not screened in India, and that was because of the multiplex's view of it being not a desire for Indian audiences, not being reflective of what Indian audiences want to see. However, it gained global success through it being screened on Netflix, which to an extent is reducing the power of multiplexes to control or censor Bollywood. So again, I'm going to quickly show you just the preview of Brahman Naman and see if you guys can understand why it would not have appealed to Indian audiences, but maybe to diasporic and wider Western audiences.
And now for the ultimate question to decide the winner.
That is the right answer. Big round of applause for that, please.
I've seen you on stage. You're a great quizzer.
Mills and Wood admired me from afar.
Seen you on stage.
At least she spoke to you face to face. Many a boat has sailed up that coconut lagoon.
I'm ready to marry her for a week. Wrong. Ping.
Meter, Gita or Sita, you boys are just going to be to your meter.
Devastating wit.
Are you coming or going?
He wouldn't know. He's never done it.
Enough is enough. Let's lose our virginity.
To the chariot.
I don't really drink. Nonsense. Everybody drinks.
Can I have a word with you?
No.
So as you can see in that film, it's got like a heavy Western content in it, but interestingly enough, it's not the diaspora in that film, it's Indians within India. So like as the multiplexes assumed, there would be very little interest because of the highly sexualized content within the film, the fact that it's pretty much almost spoken in English. It doesn't really have that kind of Bollywood feel to it. It's very Western. So that one's quite an interesting film because it's about Indians living in India, but not really reflective of, or at least the perception of Indian culture at all. And so it was not shown in the cinemaplexes at all. But as you could see, it was shown around the world in film festivals as well as screened on Netflix. So had a massive global following because of that. And then producers are still focused on appealing, even with that, the sense that they can go to films like Netflix, technology like Netflix to have their films being screened. That actually doesn't get them as much money as if it was being screened in the cinemas. And so producers still have a desire to appeal to multiplexes. So even though technology is undermining that censorship or that power the cinemaplexes have, it's not completely destroying it, and that's because the producers still want to appeal to the cinemaplexes, and therefore will and do continue to make content that they feel will appeal to Indian audiences as well as diasporic audiences to ensure that their films are screened within the cinemaplexes. And this can be seen through the influence that the cinemaplexes still have based on a court case in 2009 between producers and multiplex distributors over who should get the revenue from tickets or how much revenue they should get from the tickets. And because of this court case, cinemaplexes did not show any films between April and June in 2009, which had a massive impact on the revenue that producers received and the kinds of films that they could make in that period of time. So they still have a massive influence on what can be seen and what isn't, and therefore influencing the revenue that producers receive, therefore maintaining their interest in appealing to the multiplex cinemas constantly. And then the micro-institutions in power and censorship is the family. So the family within India, they are the most important social unit in India, and they have considerable power and control over content and access. And that's just because they can control who is seeing what within the family, as well as deciding whether or not to support a film within the cinemas. And as I've just said, producers really rely on that revenue stream, and so therefore they will include content that they feel will appeal to them. The older generations within India are the major groups that are concerned about the changing content within Bollywood, as they view it as morally corrupting, and so they'll kind of influence, their family members in what they will see, and therefore are seeing voting with their feet. So lowered consumption at multiplexes have a flow-on effect to producers, as we've seen. If the families don't go and see it, the cinemas will stop screening it, and they'll screen other films that they feel like will appeal to these family groups, and therefore those that aren't being screened as much or don't get any screening time impact on the revenue that the producers receive, and therefore sends them the message of maybe I shouldn't make a film like this in the future. And they, as I said, the older generations are concerned about the content that is being shown, and therefore they can influence what the younger generations view, based on India maintaining collective values. As India, whilst it's moving to a more Western kind of ideals, it's still very collectivist in its nature and society, and Indians within India will behave in accordance to their family desires, not necessarily individual desires. So with the ratings, if something is rated UA or A, then that controls what the family unit will or won't see, and that also restricts what the kids will see, because if the family unit don't want them to see it, they're less likely to view it, and so that definitely controls what they will and won't see, and therefore, again, if the Western content is too high, or the older generations within the family view it as morally corrupting, then the kids are very much less likely to watch it as well.